Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Blake Johnson. This week's episode is jam-packed. BBC regulars Theresa Brown and Sadikshya Nepal discuss the unfolding refugee crisis in Afghanistan. We have the latest July numbers from the U.S. Southwest border, a new court ruling on the Migrant Protection Protocols program from Texas, the confirmations of administration officials to USCIS and ICE, and finally, a brief progress update on Democrats' budget reconciliation package in Congress. All of this to come, so stick around. After 20 years of U.S. involvement, the Biden administration withdrew U.S. forces from Afghanistan this year. And this week, we saw the collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban takeover of the entire country. Images of Afghans trying to flee at the Kabul airport have been making headlines around the world. To talk about this unfolding crisis, let's bring in Theresa Brown and Sadikshya Nepal. Welcome to you both.
Hi there.
First, Sadikshya, let's turn to you. Can you give us a little background on what's happening in the region and who these refugees are and how the Biden administration is responding to this unfolding crisis?
Yeah, right. So when the crisis did happen this week, it may have felt like it came out of nowhere, but we did talk about it earlier in our podcast during the Memorial Day weekend, during the Memorial Week podcast special. We had guests here, Steve Mishka and Dave Lepan from BPC, to talk about the SIV visa program that a lot of the refugees that are leaving Afghanistan or are on track to leave Afghanistan or want to leave would qualify under. The original plan for the U.S., as we all know, was September 11th, which was moved to the end of August. And then there were reports that the United States Army just kind of left, and now the Kabul is overtaken by Taliban. And some reports do suggest that there are 300,000 people who are associated with working with U.S. military, NATO forces, and aid organizations in Afghanistan. Now, who are these people? They worked as cultural guides, interpreters, and just in aid organizations. The Biden administration did mention in their press release, or President Biden did mention in his press release yesterday, that the civilians, they did not want to leave sooner. However, that's a little hard to reconcile with the fact that there are 18,000 applications in the backlog. These are active people, refugees, ex-interpreters who fear for their life, who want to leave. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because many, like I mentioned, 300,000 of them are involved in some sort of U.S. affiliated programs in Afghanistan. They might not have even initiated their application process. So it's going to be big. It's going to be really hard. So what's the U.S. doing to these refugees? Some of them are being hosted in Fort Lee, Virginia. We've heard reports that 2,500 refugee applicants are already there or on their way there. Even like Fort Bliss in Texas has been floated around as another idea to host them. And Fort Bliss is the same shelter that was used for unaccompanied minors that was very unpopular. So we see a huge number of people that are in need of help. And in the May episode, and I couldn't help and go and listen to that again yesterday, we saw this coming, and they talked about the urgency to remove people, and they talked about the urgency that these folks need the United States to step in. So as we see this unfold, it's been a bit of a tragic situation.
It's further complicated by the U.S. abandoning their embassy and removing all their staff, so could not process people in country there. And so, Theresa, I want to turn to you very quickly. We know that Congress recently passed the Allies Act that would increase the limit of these special immigration visas, SIVs, for our allies in Afghanistan, as well as committing $1 billion to the program as part of a bipartisan emergency funding bill. Given what we know now, and to hold this, these things are changing rapidly. Do you think that Congress or the administration could have done more? And in your opinion, what do you think should they be doing now?
So I think, as Sadikshya said, there were people, particularly Afghanistan veterans, who had been trying to help their Afghan colleagues get these visas for months, who had been calling for some sort of third country evacuation essentially for those in the pipeline that the administration had started talking about, but hadn't pulled the trigger on, if you will, before this all came down. There's a lot of press reports that say the Biden administration and the military didn't realize how quickly things would fall apart once they started withdrawing. And maybe that's true. But it's not as if I think there weren't people concerned that it could happen and that they could have done more sooner. As you mentioned, Congress did pass this bill about a month and a half ago. But I think that, Congress acts fitfully and not necessarily in a very timely manner. It does expand the number of these visas available. So some of those additional people that Sadikshya was mentioning might be qualified for SIV visas. But the real emergency right now is how to get them out of the country. Because as you mentioned, we've closed the U.S. Embassy. There's nobody in the country to process those visas. They would have to make their way to another country and find a U.S. Embassy there, or manage to get on one of the U.S. planes that is evacuating people now and make their way to the United States and apply after they get here. I think that, the administration is now, doing its best to try to evacuate as many people. There are still thousands of American citizens in Afghanistan, not just in Kabul, but around the country that are trying to find their way out of the country as well. This is going to have to be a major airlift effort. And on the refugee side, many of the traditional refugee resettlement agencies are calling on volunteers to try to be ready to receive these folks. If they are temporarily settled at one of the military bases in the United States, they're more likely going to want to sort of be resettled in communities. They're going to be looking at people to sponsor them in homes or rooming houses or whatever they can. These are people who probably are going to leave with nothing more than the clothes on their back, most likely, and are going to be in great need. So the international refugee community is really sort of, leaning in to try to see what they can do. In addition, USCIS put out a call for volunteers to help people once they arrive process their visa applications, or at the very least, what's probably called humanitarian parole, which is how they'll be admitted initially to the United States. It is a bit concerning to me that none of these preparations seem to have been made sooner, given that we knew that this could be a possibility. We've spoken before on this program about how the U.S. immigration system doesn't have sort of an emergency surge capacity when we see unusual migration events like sometimes happen at the U.S. border. This is a similar situation that we should have had plans in place that we could activate as needed. And it seems like people were somewhat caught flat-footed. And unfortunately, that's putting people's lives in jeopardy.
Yeah, just a terrible situation all around. I will note that Republican governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, put out a statement earlier saying that they, as a refugee welcoming state, would be ready to receive thousands of them. So we will continue to follow this closely and try and provide some updates as they happen. Let's turn to our next segment as we return back to the U.S. land border, the southwest border, in fact. Customs and Border Protection officially released its July numbers, which we saw as being historic. A 21-year high, the number of migrants arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. Sadikshya, can you give us a little detail on what we saw in the CBP report and what the numbers tell us?
Yeah, so they continue to go upward in the trend, and we've been following it here for a couple of months now. The total number is kind of staggering at close, like 199,000, so close to 200,000 people coming. So for a second month in a row, though, single adults are actually on the decline. They declined 7% from June. What's on the incline is actually families and UACs. Families actually increased 52%, and unaccompanied minors were up by almost 25%. The family encounters are highest since May of 2019. Some of the trends that we noticed through the July numbers was some trends that we've been tracking for a while. So for this fiscal year, officially, all the nationalities outside of Northern Triangle and Mexico, which is categorized as CPB as the other nationalities, actually surpassed Mexico's arrival numbers. Those other nationalities category were totaling around 57,000, whereas Mexican arrivals were around 52,000. We saw quite a relative increase from June for countries like Nicaragua and Cuba. They track the current sort of dynamics of what's happening inside those countries. In Cuba, we saw the most historic protest happen in 30 years. Nicaragua is going through its own political turmoil. The president there is trying to run for a fourth term. So these are tracking with some of the comments that we've made in the past, that deterrence policies of like do not come don't work, and we must be paying attention to what's happening with the push factors within these countries. And I think the results in July sort of echoes that sentiment that we've been talking about. The other very important kind of switch that happened this month, first time in the fiscal year, or first time since Title 42 has been implemented, is that Title 8 actually, surpassed the Title 42 expulsions. We had 93,000 Title 8 apprehension recordings, whereas Title 42 expulsion, opposite. Title 8 was 105,000 and Title 42 was 93,000. And that kind of tracks with what DHS had implemented, I think, earlier this month with expedited removal. Most of the families do seem like they're being processed under expedited removal. We had 73,000 families that were processed under Title 8 and only 10,000 that were expelled under Title 42. So what the administration is implementing federally is kind of taking hold on the ground, and we can see that with the numbers.
Yeah, and just want to briefly point out that these numbers, as Theresa, you pointed out, these are counter-cyclical. These are happening during the hottest months of the year. It is the most dangerous time to travel, and as Sadikshya pointed out, folks outside of the Northern Triangles now are the largest category of those making the trip, suggesting that this is not just people from those countries, but this is becoming a migration route for the globe to come through. And, there may not be understanding of how dangerous this is for them.
We would say that this is now like a global phenomena. This is not just like Northern Triangle and Mexico and US sort of corridor. This is increasingly becoming like a US global corridor.
And that's going to require a more nuanced approach from the administration to properly manage this. Theresa, let's turn to you here. The ACLU just renewed its lawsuit against the Biden administration over the continuation of the Trump era policy of Title 42, which Sadikshya was just discussing. This litigation may affect the administration's response to migrant arrivals, and it's deeply unpopular with the immigrant advocates. What do you make of the situation?
Yeah, so as Sadikshya indicated, it's interesting to note that the administration seems to be using Title 42 actually less, even though they have indicated that they literally last month just renewed the Title 42 order indefinitely. They're actually using it less. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think chief among them is Mexico. Title 42 always required that Mexico would be willing to receive people back. And Mexico had some conditions. One is it can't receive so many families back. So as Sadikshya mentioned, more families are being received and processed under Title 8, either expedited removal or allowed to process their case in immigration court under Section 240 of the law. But also because more and more are coming from places not from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, or Mexico, the Mexican government is not necessarily taking them back. So they may not take back Cubans or Haitians or Nicaraguans or Ecuadorians or someone from another part of the world. So the administration has no choice but to process them under Title 8. So it's kind of ironic that at the same time the administration has said we're going to keep Title 42 and defend it in court, they're actually using it less at the border because they're not able to keep using it. And I think that this dichotomy is also kind of creating some of the confusion that many migrants have about what's happening at the border. And confusion, frankly, is the ally of smuggling organizations. When there's confusion, they come in and they say, I know what's going on. I can get you there. And they will prey on it. And I think that we're seeing that happen as well.
The administration is, as you said, been very reliant on, these policies in the past, but that's shifting. Under these expedited removal programs, how do you think this policy is going to play out in the next, over the next year?
So it's quite interesting. Expedited removal as a process can allow the US government to rapidly deport people who don't otherwise qualify for asylum. It does require that they give them an opportunity to so-called credible fear interview. But it also comes legally with the requirement for mandatory detention, which the US government doesn't really have places to put people right now. So I think in spite of their rhetoric that they want to use expedited removal more, they're not able to use it for families. Just today, as we're recording this podcast this morning, the government published its new proposed rulemaking on asylum processing. And one of the things in that asylum rule, which we'll probably talk about more at the next podcast, is to allow the government to parole out of detention families in expedited removal, basically to get around that, which means they can keep people in expedited removal proceedings without having to put them in detention. Right now, the administration is releasing more of them into the country under 240 than necessarily sending them back. But they are using it for some folks. We know, for example, that they have been sending flights of Central Americans back to the south of Mexico, including families. So I think the administration is frankly using everything that they can think of at the moment to try to manage the arrivals. And it's just growing. It's not having any sort of deterrent effect, if there is a deterrent effect to be had for this population. I think they're going to have to think again about what kind of process they're going to be putting in place in the future.
Yeah, this is obviously just an unbelievably changing dynamic that needs our attention and the attention of the administration and Congress. So we'll leave that there for now, and let's get to our next segment to cover some recent court news. It's time for the gavel. Last week, a federal judge in Texas ordered the Biden administration to reinstate the Migrant Protection Protocol, or Remain in Mexico program, a Trump-era policy that Biden ended shortly after becoming president. This court ruling has sparked a new round of litigation in the courts between conservative states and the Biden administration over immigration policy. For our listeners who may not remember or be aware of the program, Sadikshya, can you tell us what the Migrant Protection Protocols are and what the Texas ruling entailed?
Sure, it's what the heading of the Remain in Mexico. I think that gives it away, right? Like, it's implemented for any asylum seekers that are using the Mexican U.S. border to enter into the United States, and you can apply for asylum in the U.S., but you have to wait for all of the court procedures in Mexico. This creates a lot of sort of difficulty in navigating immigration law. Where do they wait in Mexico? How are the situation, like safety? It's like tent cities around. There's also this case with metering, like CBP officers only let a certain number of people to enter the United States for their courts, and it depends on place to place how they're managing this. Some of it is haphazard, some of it is organized. So it leaves a lot to be navigated by, and a lot of immigrant advocates do contend that it's illegal. There are 70,000 non-Mexican asylum seekers at the height of MPP who were waiting in Mexico to have their asylum cases read in the United States. But I think the federal judge in Texas would disagree with the immigrant advocates that this is illegal. He imposes that he adjudicated that the Biden administration should reimpose MPP. The judge is appointed by President Trump and sees that there's nothing illegal or wrong with MPP, but he has allowed a 1-week pause so that the Biden administration can file an appeal, which the administration did on Monday. It gets into really murky territory because the immigration judge, it's true that, immigration officers are allowed to tell people not to come into the United States if you're not allowed, and then wait for hearings in whatever, like other countries outside of the United States, but that rule does not really apply for asylum. So there is this like misinterpretation of immigration law there. Within refugee law or international refugee law, sending asylum seekers back to wherever they came from does violate international non-refoulement laws. So we're gonna have to wait and see how this case folds out and how it's going to evolve. But there's always the gavel for that. So
Yeah, as it heads through the likely to the Fifth Circuit and then potentially to the Supreme Court for adjudication, if unresolved. So, Theresa, let me just turn to you briefly on this. How is the Biden administration responding to this, and what do you sort of anticipate to see in the courts regarding this program?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. This is a case where, under the Trump administration that started the MPP program, you had people sue the administration saying that the program was illegal. And now, when Biden tried to end it, you had people suing Biden saying it's legal and you have to keep it. So, once again, we are in a situation where essentially we've asked the immigration courts to decide what our immigration policy should be, which, as regular listeners of the show know, I have large problems with. But with regard to this specifically, I think there are a lot of people who believe that this judge did not understand the immigration law very well, but also the implications of resuming MPP. It is an operational choice. There's no requirement that the United States send people back to Mexico, whether or not you agree that the section of law that they claim permits it. It's not a mandatory thing. It's an optional thing. And for a judge to order that the administration has to exercise this option is kind of odd. Interestingly, the judge also said that it was basically a violation of the APA, an arbitrary and capricious decision that was made without consideration of alternatives and how it could be made to work better or anything else like that, which is similar to the arguments that the Supreme Court made against the Trump administration in the way it ended DACA. So, I think what I take away from this is that, we are in an extended period where no matter what policy any administration puts forward, there will be people on the other side of the issue who will choose to try to sue in courts. And there are judges that are taking these cases that will rule one way or another that has implications, not just for the policy at issue in that particular case, but for how future administrations will conduct immigration policy. And I will say it once again for probably the millionth time, maybe not, it's only a little exaggeration. Congress needs to figure this out. Congress is the one that has the responsibility to step in and set what the rules are in immigration policy. And that this continued back and forth is just really not a good way to run things.
Oh, that's the iron rule written in stone. So, and we'll leave the gavel there for now. And let's turn to confirmations. Recently, the Senate has confirmed Jadu to be the director of USCIS, and Ed Gonzalez advanced his nomination as the new director of Immigrations and Customs Enforcement in the Senate. Theresa, we know that USCIS is at a critical junction with extended backlogs and processing and continuing financial woes. How would this nomination affect that, and what would Jadu need to do to hit the ground running?
Well, first of all, I think it's significant we finally have at least one of the three agencies with the confirmed director, and that's a good thing. She's the first woman to run the agency, and she is not new to the agency because she was in the chief counsel's office of USCIS during the Obama administration. So she has some familiarity with the agency and is very familiar with immigration law, having served in committee roles on immigration on the Hill. So she has, I think, a knowledgeable background. But you're right. The agency is facing a lot of issues right now, not the least of which is now trying to deal with expanding asylum claims at the border and dealing with the arrival of Afghan refugees. I think that it would be incumbent on Ms. Jadu to really take a look at the operations of USCIS. Yes, it can be a political agency, but really operationally is where USCIS needs to really step up to the plate. Our previous immigration intern, Andrew Lee, recently wrote a blog post looking at the troubled history of trying to make our immigration system digital and USCIS's attempts at allowing electronic filing and how that has been a just non-starter for over a decade and a half. And that has enabled some of the backlogs that we're seeing right now in lots of different types of applications. USCIS, as you noted, has struggled with fees and getting enough fees. It's mandated by law to be a fee-funded agency, but has not the resources to invest in its own workforce. It lost a lot of people, I think, under the Trump administration. And so she's going to have a lot of rebuilding to do.
We'll turn to the two other nominees for ICE and CBP. We saw Gonzalez's nomination for ICE director moved out of committee and readied for a floor vote. Is there a real holdup on this, Theresa, or do you think this will move quickly?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Ed Gonzalez was nominated for ICE and Chris Magnus was nominated for CBP. Ed Gonzalez has had his hearing, and I would say it was a mixed bag. He didn't get great reviews from either side of the aisle or for immigration advocates, but the committee did vote to advance his nomination to the floor of the Senate. So maybe when the Senate finds time in and amongst infrastructure and reconciliation, it can find time to vote on his nomination, and we'll see if that proceeds. Meanwhile, Chris Magnus is still waiting. And again, these are the agencies that are at the center of what's happening on immigration right now, whether it's the asylum and refugee system in Afghanistan, what's going on in at the border, and they haven't had Senate confirmed leaders. ICE has not had a Senate confirmed leader since the Obama administration, because there was never a Senate confirmed leader during Trump. CBP has not had a Senate confirmed leader since Kevin McAleenan left the job halfway through the Trump administration. So these are agencies in desperate need of leadership, and for Biden not to have his full team available right now as he's dealing with all of these things, I think is continuing to be problematic. So, regardless of where people think these particular individuals are, I think it's incumbent on the administration and the Senate to move things forward and let's get some people in these jobs.
Are they going to be able to overcome things like, abolish ICE, dealing with that negative PR and rhetoric? Can Ed Gonzalez sort of like turn the tide on that with advocates, or where are we with the the stronger left community to be able to accept these positions?
Well, I think at the end of the day, ICE has a job to do that Congress has mandated it to do, and it's an enforcement job. And yes, many advocates may not like that, but the Biden administration has made very clear that they don't intend to abolish ICE. But they are looking for reforms. And Ed Gonzalez, when he was the police chief of his city, did make some reforms that advocates liked. I think that it's going to be a case of wait and see for them. I don't think that should stop this from getting a vote in the Senate. I have a hard time thinking that the Biden administration won't be able to pull off the necessary 50 votes to get him confirmed if they actually put it on the floor.
And finally, many of our listeners may know it's the congressional budget season here in Washington, D.C., and we've spoken about the reconciliation process being used by Democrats to try and push through major initiatives of President Biden's agenda, which includes some immigration provisions. Last week, after a long round of floor votes on amendments known as a vote-a-rama, the Senate passed its budget resolution, which now makes its way to the House. Let's bring in Laura Hall, Managing Director of BPC Action, which is BPC's advocacy partner organization. Laura, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Blake. Happy to be here.
So, Laura, do you have an update for us on the budget resolution and what is happening with the immigration provisions, and what should we expect in the coming months?
Well, I have a little bit of an update for you. I think as much as folks can know right now, you kind of laid out where the debate stands right now. The budget resolution passed the Senate. It now is pending on the House calendar. I will also flag another piece of legislation that's pending on the House calendar, since these two things are kind of tied together. The infrastructure bill, folks might recall, the Senate in a bipartisan way passed a large bill a couple weeks ago that deals with kind of like the actual tangible infrastructure, like roads, bridges, broadband internet, kind of access to a bunch of different infrastructure programs, that is now also pending before the House of Representatives. There are a few different views in the House on the path forward in most specifically how the House should sequence these two bills. There's Speaker Pelosi and others have kind of indicated a desire to take up the budget bill first. The budget bill would pave the way towards budget reconciliation, which Democrats hope will include a lot of their other priorities, from paid leave and some of the more progressive policies. They would like to take that bill up first before they take the infrastructure bill up. More moderate group of Democratic lawmakers is hoping to pass the infrastructure bill first. They're in a bit of a standoff right now as to who will blink first. Will the moderate Democrats agree to pass the budget bill first? As of right now, it's slated for early next week. Or will Speaker Pelosi and some of her more progressive allies change their tune a bit and agree with the moderates' demands to take up the infrastructure bill first? I think the moderate caucus was dealt a little bit of a blow earlier this week when President Biden came out and said that he kind of agreed with Speaker Pelosi's plan to tackle budget reconciliation and allowed her kind of the ability to kind of set the agenda in the House chamber and determine which one is to come up first. I think that given, Biden and Schumer and Pelosi, all three together, kind of feel that reconciliation should be the next thing the House tackles. I have a feeling that that's eventually where we'll end up. All that said, if you don't like how things are going, wait a little bit. It seems that this is an issue that's changing fairly frequently. So it remains to be seen, but I anticipate that things will start moving next week when the House is back from their August recess.
Well, it seems like we're going to have to just wait and see for now and see what happens with leadership. Sounds like there's a lot going on behind the scenes there. A bit of arm twisting, traditional congressional politics at play. Nothing uncommon for DC, right?
Yes, it's definitely kind of standard operating procedure a little bit. I also did want to mention that the immigration provisions are still very much part of the conversation. I have heard them being part of the negotiation package for the reconciliation bill and others. I think, as you mentioned, a lot of it is kind of standard operating procedure for Congress. We'll wait and see what eventually comes out in a final bill. But right now, both sides are trying to argue their points and get their favorite provisions included in what is sure to be a pretty large package.
And even if they manage to do the arm twisting, pass the reconciliation bill, get it to it still has to go through the Senate parliamentarian, correct? To be approved?
Yes, that is a big hurdle. Everything involved in the budget reconciliation legislation has to have a direct budgetary implication. I think you have folks that argue that there are certain immigration policies that certainly do, but I think you have other views that aren't quite so clear about whether there's a direct budgetary implication by some of these immigration policies. You're exactly right that it comes down to the ruling of the parliamentarian, who is kind of a procedural, nonpartisan employee of the Senate who kind of calls balls and strikes on some of these matters of reconciliation and whether it's, germane to be included. So I think we don't know yet. There's a lot of crystal balling, but until the parliamentarian actually rules, we can't say for sure.
Well, we'll leave it there for This Week in Immigration. Thanks, Laura, for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
All right, one last time, a reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Blake Johnson. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Theresa Cardinal Brown, Sadikshya Nepal, and myself. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcast is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.